All right, everybody, we're about 1 minute to the top of the hour, so we'll go ahead and get started. And just as a reminder, so if you're in the chat box right now and you are putting in your name and where you're from, it would be great if you could make sure your message is addressed to all panelists and attendees. The default is just to send it to all panelists. So where it says to, go over there, click the down arrow and make that all panelists and attendees, unless you are trying to tell me that I have food on my face or something like that, and you want it just to come to me. So, so we have a big crowd today. We have 72 folks in the room so far. I'm sure that number will go up a little bit more. And we have two wonderful guest presenters. So I don't want to take up too much time with an introduction today. I will say a few things about what we have ahead for us, but I really want to get to the kind of the meat and potatoes of our presentation today. So anyway, I see that we have a ton of people introducing themselves in the chat box. Wonderful. We'll go ahead and get started on our end. Joined here by Claire Ratcliffe.
Hey guys.
I'm Brooks Mitchell. We're on the professional development team here at StarNet. Our camera's a little bit higher today, so you'll have to bear with us as we strain our necks to look up. So just a few quick housekeeping notes. You're not going to have microphone access today. You're going to be interacting through the chat box. Make sure that you're making that chat to all panelists and attendees. Feel free to mess around with the video feed. Find your toolbar. Go ahead. It's either going to be at the top or the bottom of your screen. Find that toolbar. That's where the poll question is going to be launched from. That's where your chat box is going to be as well. If at any point during this presentation you have questions, you're like, hey, I can't figure out where to find my chat box or something like that. Well, let me any other questions besides the chat box, chat to directly me or Claire or Kelly and LeConte, and we may be able to redirect you with some technical help. Ava and Aparna are going to be, really digging through the weeds of their presentation, so we don't want to distract them too much. So let me go ahead and just go, like I said, I'm joined here by Claire Ratcliffe. We're going to be just saying a few words today, not too much. And then on the other end, we have Ava and Aparna from the Avarna Institute. We will allow them to more formally introduce themselves in just a moment. So if you aren't familiar with what we do in our StarNet, our Star Library Network, I want to talk really quickly about our STEM Activity Clearinghouse. So this is where you can find over 430 hands-on activities meant for the library setting. They are all free hands-on activities. They have been vetted by different sources, and we've kind of curated them, put them all together in one place and made them easily sortable for you. So that's not what today's webinar is about, though. If you do have questions about the clearinghouse, let me know. Again, if you just want to take a quick screen capture of this slide, or just I can email this to you afterwards. We have plenty of links to send you, but these are just kind of all of our free resources that we have through StarNet. I want to focus on that second one, that Our Planet Earth campaign. That is something that we are doing through, it's kind of a new initiative for, not only is it, Earth Science Week, it's I think Citizen Science Month, and then Earth Day in April this year. So we're doing a really big campaign full of free resources, free information, a lot of guest resources as well, and kind of putting that all together in one page. That again is our Planet Earth website. And Claire will be doing a webinar about that later in February. So just a few little housekeeping notes. I saw somebody ask in the chat box or in the question and answer if this would be closed captioned. The YouTube recording that we are live streaming to YouTube, and it'll be closed captioned through that, so you can view that through the recording.
And it'll be about 24 hours after the viewing is done. So by this time tomorrow, you can watch the YouTube recording, and it will have closed captioning at that time.
Yep. All right, so I want to do a quick poll question. I know we mostly have libraries here with us. That's who we work with, but I wanted to see if there's any other institutions joining us today, or if it was primarily libraries. So we'll give you guys, like, I don't know, 20 seconds to answer this. All right. So we can see the results coming in from our end. All right. So we'll go ahead and launch that. I think we've seen enough here, Claire.
Yeah, looks like a good group.
Yeah, so mostly libraries, about 94% libraries, a K through 12, a science center, a university, and then an other. So I'll see what that person said in the chat box. But great, awesome spread. We are going to be talking a lot about a library focus today, but a lot of these lessons you could apply to any kind of informal learning institution. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to our wonderful guest presenters. We're so happy to have Ava and Aparna joining us today to talk about such an important issue and to kind of be our subject matter experts. So without further ado, Ava and Aparna.
Great. Thanks, everyone. I'm just going to pull up my PowerPoint for you all and put it in presenter mode. So hi, everyone. I'm Ava Holliday. I use she, hers pronouns, and I'm calling you today from Missoula, Montana, which is also Bitterroot Salish land. Aparna and I, Aparna, she's just to my left here, but she'll introduce herself in a second. We are co-founders of the Avarna Group. We support outdoor, environmental, experiential educators in their justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion work. And a lot of what we do is educational work, either through webinars or through in-person engagements. And we talk a lot about unconscious bias. So that's what we're doing with you all today. I'll hand it off to Aparna to introduce herself, and then we'll get going.
Hi, everyone. I'm Aparna Rajagopal, the other founding partner of the Avarna Group. I wish we were an institute. It makes us sound much more academic than we are. But we are a group of folks, 6 folks across the country. I use she, hers pronouns, and I'm calling you from what's now Eugene, Oregon, which is Kalapuya land. And it's in Willamette Valley. I'll leave it at that. Just one more thing. I'll just quickly put a plug in that I have a STEM background. I was a chemical engineer for some time and also practiced intellectual property law. So it's really exciting for me to be working with you all at the intersection of what I do now and STEM.
So I want to give you just a couple of logistical details and notes before we get started. So Brooks did a great job sort of describing Zoom. Hopefully you all are fairly familiar with Zoom. We'll be asking you all questions throughout this entire webinar, and hopefully you all will be able to participate. You can type your question or your comment into the chat box. As you all probably can see, it's really busy in there. So it's possible that we won't see something. And so if you really have like a burning question, it's a little bit easier for us as facilitators to see the Q&A section, but either way, we will be checking both. Since I am presenting my own screen, I'll be asking Aparna to sort of keep track of the questions, but hopefully we'll be able to answer almost every question that you all have. So that's how we're hoping to interact with you all today. And then I want to just give you all sort of an overview of what we're going to do, and then we'll get into a little bit of an icebreaker. So we're going to be discussing unconscious bias and how it impacts the way that we think, how that impacts the way that you all interact with your patrons, with community members, with library institutions at large. At the end of this webinar, you'll most likely have more questions, which often means that we've done our job. We will be providing you all with a PDF of this PowerPoint at the end, and I will hand that off to Brooks and Claire, who hopefully know how to get it to you all. So if taking notes really quickly isn't your style, or if you really want to sit and read the material, this is available to you all in addition to the YouTube recording. And so today we're really just going to be giving you all a primer on what unconscious bias is, how it sort of functions in our brains, and then also some ways in which it may show up in your work in libraries and other educational institutions, and some guiding questions and tips on how to work through that. So that's what we're up to today. I am going to turn off my my webcam, just so you all don't see me furrowing my brow all the time. And then I want to just get into our little icebreaker question, which is, what is the difference between these two tables? And you can type that into the Q&A, or you can type that into the chat box.
And I'm keeping track here. One person says perspective, shape. Another perspective, height, length, width, shape, location, length, size, orientation of the book. One is rectangular, one is square, lengthwise, and the other isn't. Direction of the book, accessibility. Oh, that's a good one. Perspective of the viewer. The longer table sits more across. Books are a different shape. Accommodation of seated participants, perspective.
Great.
And they're still coming in, but I'll pause there.
We'll pause there because I think the last I saw, there's 96 of you. There's actually 107 of you online, so we're not going to be able to get all of your answers in here, but hopefully you all were able to answer that just for yourself, at least. And all of your answers are valid. Those are great observations. And I wanted to just show you this little GIF or GIF, which is the tables are actually the same shape. So I asked you a little bit of a leading question of like, what's the difference between the two of them? There are some differences, of course, but the actual shape of the table is the same. And if you are feeling a little skeptical, if you think it changes while it's moving, in all of the free time that you all have after this webinar, you can take the PDF and you can actually trace the parallelograms, and you can see that they're actually the same shape. So we do this because it's a really great way for us to just start thinking about the ways in which our brains function, the ways in which our brains sometimes play tricks on us, and start thinking about how bias might show up in all of our work. So I will play this for the last time, and then I'm going to hand it off to Aparna, who's going to get really into what bias is and how it functions.
Great. So, we just did an activity with tables, and you're probably wondering, what's the point of that? I think that ultimately the illustrator of this image played with with perspective to cause us to think that the tables were the same size. But if you translate that to the world of humans, similar things can happen. And so I wanted to share another scenario with you. I'm going to show it on the screen, but also read it out loud. And I want to take a moment to create this picture in your head. There are no wrong pictures. And when you're ready, we'll have some questions for you to answer. So first, let me read the scenario. After scrubbing down, a surgeon walks into surgery for a routine appendectomy. The surgeon greets the patient and the surgical team, tells the patient about the process of the surgery, and then instructs the anesthesiologist to begin the anesthesia process. A surgical nurse assists in the anesthesia process, while another continues to organize the surgical instruments. Once the patient is fully under, the surgeon turns to one of the nurses and says, "Let's get started, scalpel, please." So take a moment to create that picture in your head. And I'm going to advance the slide and ask you all a few questions. And I'll say before, well, it's already up there, but you are all good people. And if you notice, we did not add race or gender to this image. So I'm curious what you created in your head, in your mental picture. What race and gender was a surgeon? And what race and gender was a nurse? You can go ahead and type that in the questions box, the chat box. Surgeon male, nurse female. Surgeon is Meredith Gray. So Gray's Anatomy. It's easy to form a mental picture of a male white surgeon and a female nurse. Not really visible, hands with tools. I know y'all can read this, but I'll just read it out loud in case. One white male, then white female. Surgeon was female, male nurse. So I'm seeing a lot of answers coming in. And one person said, even knowing what was ahead, I still pictured the surgeon as a male. Great. So as I see all of you typing it in, it sounds like the majority of you pictured the surgeon as a male, and the majority of those pictured the surgeon as a white male, and then majority of folks pictured the nurse as a woman. And we get a lot of different answers to these questions, and it's not really meant to be a gotcha, but instead an exploration of how our own unconscious biases impact the way we create mental pictures and make sense of the world. So my next question to you all, it's a couple of questions, is where did that mental picture come from, and what's the impact, especially for those of you who pictured the surgeon as a male or white male and the nurse as a woman? So those are two separate questions, and I know some of you already typed out things like Gray's Anatomy, so we know media comes into play. Where else does that mental picture come from? And what's the impact of picturing the surgeon as a male? So family connections. Niece is a doctor, textbooks, environment, representation, lived experience. My father's a doctor, my mother's a nurse, so personal experiences. A lot of folks having personal experiences. Sorry if we hit a little too close to home there. Recent interactions, grade school reading. So right, you all work in libraries, so the books you have influence people, TV, movies, media. Great. So let's pause there and let me ask folks, and I'll scroll up and see if folks answer the second question of what the impact is. And one person says, the impact is I must be accepting things without even thinking of it, right? If you're, and I'll put words in your mouth here, is that if your unconscious image of a doctor is a white male and the unconscious image of a nurse is a woman, that seems to be normative in your head, and it's just accepted without question. Another person says one impact is the idea of authority being male, helpers being female, which is all pervasive. Another person says aspiration in our society, right? If there's a young person of color, for example, who wants to be a surgeon, and all of our unconscious mental pictures of surgeons are white male, what does that tell that young person? Oftentimes we hear, you got to see one to be one. And if we're not seeing one in our heads, it's really hard for young people to even see themselves in those jobs. And one person says, it's just really odd because I don't even think that way. Right. And this is the insidious part of unconscious bias, is I am guessing that all of us on the line, all 107 of us, know that people of all races and genders can be surgeons and nurses, yet the influence of media, the influence of books, of societal norms is so all pervasive that it impacts the way our brains unconsciously process information, and that can be problematic. Another impact that I didn't hear you all mention, and maybe I lost it, is that it can actually really influence the way that you interact with folks. So one story is that on a Delta Airlines flight, a passenger needed medical help, and the flight attendant said, "We need a doctor," and a Black woman stood up. And in that moment of stress, that flight attendant's unconscious bias really guided her, and she, in that moment, said, "Sit down, honey, we need a real doctor." And those are that's an extreme interaction, but think about all the times maybe you can think of that folks maybe mistook a woman surgeon for the nurse, or if maybe unconsciously there might be questioning competence if you are presented with a surgeon who's not a person of, who's not white or who's not a man. So all of these things happen. And if we kind of translate this from the hospital world to the world that you all are in libraries, there could be assumptions that you all make about your colleagues, your patrons, community members that are just inaccurate and ultimately unfair. Or you may make assumptions about what you think your patrons want to read or what kind of programming they want, which again may be inaccurate. So we just did a couple of activities to talk about, to sort of explore the fact that we have bias. I wanted to present some definitions to you all. So what we just talked about is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is your tendency to interpret information based on a way that confirms your own previous beliefs and experiences. So this is the idea of filling in the pieces of a puzzle or story, creating that mental picture. There are a couple of other types of bias that we wanted to talk about. The next one is this idea of affinity bias. So this is about unconscious preferences that we have for people who are more like us. For you all, this idea of gravitating toward people who are more like you may show up in a lot of different ways. It may show up in hiring, of course. It could also show up in those patrons that you naturally gravitate toward. And so while it can be really nice to find people with similar life backgrounds, especially those who have felt excluded from groups like people of color, LGBTQ folks, Indigenous folks, people with disabilities, but as library staff, it's really important to ensure that you're giving each patron the care and attention that they need based on their needs, rather than your connection to them. So the last type of bias I wanted to talk about is selection bias, which is really, related to affinity bias. But this is the idea that you select information that supports what you already know and believe. And we see this all the time in the media, in the news. As library staff, I think this may show up in the array of information that you share with your patrons. And it's really important to allow your patrons to come to their own conclusions about the world instead of coming to those conclusions for them. If you have question marks in your head right now, don't worry about it. We're going to provide a lot more concrete examples of how bias shows up in just a little bit. So the next thing I'm going to do is just talk about a little more information about what's happening in our brains when we fill in the blanks, let's say when we're given very little information. So every moment we receive a lot of information, 11 billion bits of it, and we can only process 40 bits of that information. And so 99.999996, that's a big number of what we process is unconscious. So bias is a natural function of our brains. We cannot possibly process all of the stimuli around us. And so our brain creates shortcuts based on past experiences to essentially allow us to operate on autopilot for a lot of our day and only consciously process what we need to consciously process. So the way that it's been described to us, and our apologies if there's some science folks in the room here that may be able to more accurately describe this, but what we've heard is that when we as humans, let's say, encountered a tiger and saw that it was a predator for the first time, something called myelin sheaths, which is fatty tissue developed around our neural pathways that would allow electrical current to pass more quickly between certain neurons. And in the case of a tiger, once we saw that it was a predator, it would allow electrical current to pass more quickly between the connection of brown and orange and white stripy creature and predator and danger. And so the next time we saw a tiger, even if it was not the whole tiger, like in this image, little tiger that's in the grass, we didn't have to consciously process whether, does it have 4 legs? Is it an animal? What kind of animal is it? Because if we had to consciously process that tiger every time, we would have been lunch and not have survived as a species. And so, the reality is that if we had to consciously process everything if it were new, we wouldn't be able to operate in the world. And so bias is what allows us to survive, and bias is what allows us to operate. Some have described this as muscle memory for the brain, if that analogy helps for you all. So if none of those specific definitions of bias or the way that I describe it works for you, here's a really simple general definition of bias, which is unconscious bias. And by the way, we use unconscious bias, implicit bias, and hidden bias interchangeably. So unconscious bias is unconscious, subtle, involuntary assumptions or judgments we make every day based on our past experiences, identities, and culture. So at this point, I imagine a lot of you are saying, okay, so what? If bias is just the way we think, why is it bad? We like to be really clear that just because it's the way our brains operate doesn't excuse us from having to grapple with our biases and from having to unpack all the different ways in which we might make assumptions. So we like to be clear about the bias that we want to interrupt and the bias that we really don't care about. So we say that the bias that we want to interrupt, the bias we want to grapple with, is the bias that is informed by or reinforces systems of power or privilege. You may have also heard it as systems of oppression. All of those isms in society: racism, classism, sexism, colonialism, ableism. These are just a few isms on this screen right here. And so when the ways that we think unconsciously reinforce those isms or are informed by them, that is the bias that is dangerous. You can see our really advanced PowerPoint animation skills here. So, so another way we talk about this is that bias becomes an issue when it means that we're treating people inequitably based on their identities, specifically disadvantaged identities. So I care more that folks unconsciously think that a surgeon looks like a white man than I care about folks unconsciously thinking 2 tables are totally different when they're exactly the same, or when they're exactly the same shape. So that is a bias we really want to grapple with. So I just very quickly did a couple of activities and talked about the concept of bias. And so before we move on to how bias shows up in the work that you all do, I'm going to pause and just see if you all have any specific questions. Great. So one of the questions is, would you break down the difference between confirmation bias and selection bias? There are a lot of, I think that they're overlapping. They operate in similar ways. I think one is really about the assumptions that we make based on very limited information, and one is about the information that we seek to pay more attention to, and the information that we seek to ignore. And I know that's just semantics, but in that doctor image, we didn't provide you with race or gender. And so you filled in the blanks with no information. Let's say I read you a really long narrative of a story. I'm guessing with all that information coming at you, there'd be some information that you would select in your head as more important and some information that you would select as less important based on selection bias. Ava, do you have any more thoughts on this, this question?
The only thing that I would add is that I think a lot about selection bias when thinking about what information I'm going to present to learners. And that's why Aparna had said we're going to talk about it a little bit more, versus confirmation bias is my brain filling in the gaps. I think that that's just like a slightly different way of describing what Aparna was talking about it. But I really think I wanted to add in selection bias for you all, given that you all are curating experiences and information and knowledge for your patrons.
Great. Thank you. One other person asked, does our unconscious mind work more quickly than our thinking mind? Yes. So the unconscious brain works much more quickly than the conscious brain. It comes from a completely different parts as far as I know of the anatomy of our brains. There are a bunch of resources about this. And I think there's even a leadership book about how to make, to avoid the sort of quick knee-jerk decision making that comes from our unconscious mind and think much more mindfully. So another person asked, libraries are predominantly made up by white women. How can libraries be part of exposing bias while recognizing we're part of a long history of systemic racism and social inequities? That's a big question. Thanks for asking that. I will say, right, I think attending a 1.5 hour webinar is either hopefully the beginning or the middle of a journey that you are all on. And the way that we see this work happening, and we'll talk about it in a little bit, is a lot of the work is personal work, because I think people need to know how they show up and how they make assumptions individually. And so doing your personal work is really important. And then recognizing when bias might be showing up in your policies, in your programs, in your physical built environment, in the books that you actually choose to hold in your libraries and the ones you don't. Those are some of the ways that bias shows up. And then also just thinking as a society, how systemic racism, systemic classism, systemic sexism, all those systems of oppression influence people's access and influence people's ability to get an education, which is something that you all offer. So I think it's a journey, and I think attending webinars like this is part of that journey. Influencing people that you know who are within your sphere of influence is another part of that journey. Ava, do you have any more answers to this? It's a big question.
Yeah, there's just two guiding thoughts that I have, because when it gets down to like the tactics and strategies of doing this work, we could be talking forever. But one is to remember that we all have a place in doing justice and equity work, and it is incumbent upon us to figure out how to do that. And so I want to encourage you all to sort of keep digging in and talking to other folks who may have similar identities to you that are also really invested and interested in doing this work, to start thinking through how you can contribute to the world that you want to live in, while also making sure that you're paying close attention and doing deep listening with folks who have marginalized identities. And then I totally just forgot my second guiding thought. Oh, never mind. I remembered it. The second thing that I think is really helpful for me is really understanding the history of how, for you all, like how libraries came to function as these really important social institutions, while also understanding that they were impacted and imbued with these isms, and figuring out what that looked like historically and what that looks like today. That's been very, very helpful for me, like as a white woman, to figure out how do I fit into this work and how can I move this work forward. So those are just two more like guiding thoughts to think about rather than strategies. I did see that there is a person that talked about inviting speakers with different racial and ethnic backgrounds and other groups to speak. I think that's a fantastic strategy. And there's a whole bunch more that we really encourage you all as a community to continue to build together.
Great. And there are a couple more real quick things. One person mentioned the exact book I was thinking of, whose title I couldn't remember, which is Thinking Fast and Slow. It's not technically about bias, but it's really a great book to describe how the difference between the conscious and the unconscious brain. One person mentioned that they ironically think of a librarian as a woman with glasses. And I think it's really interesting that though that particular image may not reinforce, you got to think about like, what does that mean in terms of, well, it might actually reinforce sexism if you think of librarians as taking on a certain role in society that's more nurturing. It may also reinforce racism if that image is a white woman. And so continuing to sort of peel back the layers of those unconscious images is really important. Okay, I'm going to pause there, and I see a few more questions coming in. We'll get to them as we continue. I'm going to really quickly talk about how, we want to get down to the nitty gritty of how does bias show up? And we've already started talking about that, but let's do that more intentionally. So at the Avarna Group, we like to use frameworks to talk about specific concepts. And so we talk about how bias shows up in 3 different lenses in the work that we do. So the top here in this Venn diagram is individual. So this is the bias that we just examined with those scenarios. It describes your intra and interpersonal actions, the assumptions you make and the ways you interact with others. It refers to the bias that manifests in your lives. It's often expressed in those interactions. It's also the bias that people talk about the most when we prompt them for examples. But bias doesn't just stop at us as individuals, it gets amplified into institutions. And that's something Ava just talked about. It's the history of libraries. Institutional bias refers to practices and policies that are endemic to an organization that have some sort of bias, and it can unwittingly exclude people or communities from accessing your libraries generally, or accessing or having meaningful experiences on your programs based on their identities, their experience, and their experiences. And then the third I is industry. And we like to use industry because it's a nice alliteration, though I think it means different things to different people. But this is really about the library sector as a whole, and how over generations there have been some norms that have been created within this really important social institution that you are all part of. And these cultures, like library cultures, reflect the vision of a dominant culture, and they're not inclusive of a lot of people. So Ava and I, we're not library experts by any stretch of the imagination, but as Ava said, we encourage you all to think about the history of libraries, the formation, the maintenance of libraries, and how and who those folks were that created libraries, who benefited from it, who was excluded, despite the fact that we all know it's supposed to be for everybody, a place for community building. So when we run day-long workshops, we take all this information and more and talk at length about how bias shows up in all of these 3 lenses. But today, with just an hour left, we're going to just provide a few examples of how bias shows up, primarily focusing on the programming that you all do. I don't know what roles you all have within your libraries, but it's going to be a bigger emphasis on the programming piece. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about the structure of the programs, and also the built environment and patron interactions at your libraries. So that's what we're going to talk about for the rest of the time. And I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to hand it off to Ava.
Great. So before I move on to some more slides, I wanted to just highlight a comment that was made by our Case Stark. And this person says, as a woman of color in libraries, I think it's important to reconsider the systems in libraries that reinforce biases and outright isms. But it's equally important to support the people of color who are in the profession and to learn to be a good ally. I wanted to emphasize this because, as Aparna said, we're not going to be able to get through everything today. And one of the things that we are not really touching on is how you can support people with marginalized identities, specifically people of color, LGBTQ folks, people with disabilities, who are library professionals, and making sure that you have these really positive interactions with your colleagues, that you're able to support one another, and be able to address microaggressions together and be a good ally. So I want to just put that out there because that's another slice of this work, and it's a very important piece. And it's something that we're not going to dive too deeply in today, just because, as you all can see, this body of work is pretty massive.
There's one more quick comment, and I'm sure this will all get captured, hopefully in the post recording. But we're not going to talk about the Dewey Decimal System, so I wanted to put it out there that one person talked about how it's really important to think about the legacy of the Dewey Decimal System. And now I have a lot of questions, and I'm going to look it up.
So as Aparna said, we wanted to get into talking about these institutional tips. So we're really going to be talking about program content and delivery, and then also some program structure pieces to think about. But before I get into that, I would love to hear from you all. What are some strategies that you all engage in to mitigate bias, to address those isms that we've been talking about, in your libraries or in your institutions, or even within the ways in which you are able to show up as an ally for colleagues of color or for women, for LGBTQ folks. Would love to just hear a couple of examples from you all of like ways in which you're already doing this work, because I imagine that you all are already doing some really important and great work mitigating bias. So one person says include community partners in the planning process. Regulated training after incidents have mounted. Great, we like to see that, but we also like to see that pre-work, that pre-training that you all are doing right now. Making sure I use books with a variety of races in my story times, fantastic. Anything else? Oh, now they're coming in. Planning community programs and events that reflect the interests of the communities. Sometimes I have to ask myself, would I be having the same reaction or make the same decision if it was another person involved? Great. Might not be a smarty pants, but we are recataloging the 200s on alternate the Dewey Decimal System to be more inclusive. Similar to Aparna, I am so fascinated about this, and I will look it up later.
Oh, I wonder, based on this comment, they're using an alternate Dewey Decimal, so I wonder if the numbers representing the book, coding the books, are like in order of value of the book. So 200, religion being more important.
That's just our own wondering. Whenever I make a display, I look to make sure I've been inclusive of gender, sexuality, race. Great. Book displays incorporating different races, ages, and cultures. Marketing and display should be inclusive. Someone is asking, what about ageism? Absolutely an ism to be thinking about, both from the ways in which we treat and trust young people, as well as folks who are getting older. Ageism sort of shows up at both that in those really young, for young people and for older folks in just a different way. So really important to think about both ends of our lives.
One person actually says, as ageism as a teen librarian, I gave a talk to staff about how to approach different developmental behaviors in the library. Thanks for sharing that.
Great. Okay, there's a lot coming in, and these are all really fantastic, and I'm hoping that we can capture all of these so you all can just see the work that you all have been doing, and maybe get in touch if you have a question about how someone has been able to engage in a particular structure or a strategy. But so I'm gonna keep going, because I think we could probably do this all day long, which is great. And we'll also have a little bit of a time for Q&A at the end where we can pick this back up. But I want to just make sure we can get through the content that we provided for you all today. So we often think about program content in these 3 different ways, and I'm sure that you all have heard of this in some way or another. So we want to make sure that all of the lessons that you all are creating, and really anything that you're creating, is culturally relevant, meaning that you are able to connect your lessons or whatever you're creating to your patrons' lives and culture. The second way that we think about this, and this really speaks to that sort of question around selection bias, is you want to make sure that your lessons or your programs are culturally responsible. So this means that you're tackling bias and consistently presenting multiple perspectives. I think some of you have already been speaking to this, of like making sure that in story time there are different races and genders represented in the stories, but we're also thinking about like, whose expertise are you pulling from? And then finally, wanting to make sure that when you are doing any sort of instruction, giving directions, all the way to providing information, you want to make sure that you can employ multiple instructional strategies to reach all, sorry, that should say patrons, not patron. So this is sort of what we're going to walk through, a couple of tips and questions to ask yourself to really make sure that the program content is culturally relevant, it's culturally responsible, and it's culturally responsive. If these categories are still a little bit fuzzy for you, one way to think about it is, okay, if you're creating content, making sure that it connects to people's lives. And then as you are actually delivering, or the pedagogy, thinking about how you are actually facilitating. So that was helpful for me when I was first learning about these 3 different R's, relevant, responsible, and responsive. Just thinking about the first two are about content. The last one is really about how you facilitate or instruct, however you think about the work that you do. So I want to talk about culturally relevant programs or curriculum, however you think about it. And instead of giving you all like a bazillion tips, I wanted to just present a whole bunch of questions to consider as you all are creating any sort of program content. So really thinking about what are the demographics of your current and intended audience. This could be something that you pull up the data on if you have that information. It could be if you're newer to a community, looking at census data can be helpful. Or you can ask folks, you know, historically who's shown up or who do we really want to reach? So just really knowing who your audience is and the demographics. And then thinking about what are their day-to-day experiences and how do their day-to-day experiences relate to the program objectives? You know, is it mostly young people coming in who are coming in after school and they're, you know, why are they there? What is their previous like couple of hours looked like? And then also maybe what's on their mind? How can you create program objectives that really connect to them? Then what are aspects of their values and culture? So if you all are working with intact groups like school groups, you can really ask like, what do you all sort of, how do you identify yourselves as a school? If you're working with lots of families or particular community members, really digging into like, what are their values? Like what's important to them? What are some of the cultural hallmarks of these community members? And you often can sort of figure this out and just understanding how they spend their time in their day. And as I said earlier, for intact groups, what are the existing cultural norms? So speaking to teachers ahead of time can be really, really helpful, or any sort of, you know, program coordinator, whoever is your liaison, and seeing if you can integrate that into your curriculum or your program. And then just thinking about the languages that folks speak. If there are languages besides English that is predominantly spoken in the community, consider programming in that language if that's possible for you all. That can be a huge way to make something relevant. And so someone just feels much more comfortable in that particular, learning in that particular language. And then the last thing that I think about is there any past history specifically related to the library and the community that you need to know about? So that can be really positive interactions that community members have had, but it also can be any sort of tension that has existed. And being sure to understand that when you're creating programming or content for them can be really, really helpful, and just understanding where they're coming from. So that's just the sort of cultural relevance piece. A lot of it, I mean, these are 6 guiding questions, but a lot of it is really just about getting to know folks who are coming to your library, and then also getting to know folks that you want to come to your library or to your institution, figuring out who they are, what's important to them, and what some of their cultural norms are. So that's really what we're just trying to get across here in this particular slide. If those questions don't totally make sense to you, another way to sort of, another couple of tips or questions to think about is really, I think about this as like connecting the dots. So I pulled up an old picture of those connect the dots pictures that I used to do as a kid. And someone had already mentioned this, but you can actually ask the community what they need or what they want, making sure that you are connecting with your patrons through surveys, conversation, and solicit feedback after programs. So that's one way in which you can actually start to gather the information and answer the questions that I asked in the previous slide. Then do your best to create programming in which they can see themselves. So connect the dots between the program content and their daily lives. So if you are working with 4th graders, understanding like what their day is like versus people who are in their teens, they're going to potentially have a little bit of a different daily life than a 4th grader. People who are in a hyper urban setting versus folks who are in rural settings. Just really thinking through creating content that where they can really see themselves. One of the simplest ways to do that is using, if you're ever sort of creating scenarios like we did earlier, creating scenarios that like they can see themselves acting in that particular scenario. Or you can even use patrons' names if you have like gotten to know them over time, so they literally can see themselves in a particular scenario that you're using. And then the final one is connecting dots to important issues impacting surrounding communities. So for example, if there are issues of water quality that are coming up in the community, connect your programming to that in some way or another. If people are really concerned about police violence, for example, make sure that you can sort of connect your programming to that. People will start to gravitate towards that and be like, yes, these are things that I'm really concerned about. Or it could be, it doesn't necessarily need to be important issues. It could just be like a holiday, an important holiday that's coming up, or a celebratory day that's coming up. So these are all things to think about when you're wanting to literally connect the dots with your programming and your content creation to your patrons.
Ava, a lot of folks have been sharing ways in which they're accomplishing that first R. I just wanted to, since we're ending that, talk about it really quickly. Folks mentioned the American Community Survey, though someone said it's in rural areas, languages aren't always reflected in it. Other folks are talking about, so StarNet actually has a guide for community dialogues that can really help you get to know the values, wants, and needs of your community. And there's a link there in the chat box. Another person talked about inviting people to come in for a show and tell to really get to know the different cultures represented in the community. And then also just using thinking about the publicity that you use for programming to reach that broader audience in your community. So thank you for sharing all those ideas. I'm sure there are more coming in, but one of the things that we have realized is that our participants often learn better and more from each other, that peer learning is much more effective than us talking at them. So I wanted to share that.
Great. Those are all fantastic. So I want to move on to creating culturally responsible content or curriculum or programming, however you think of it. And this to us often feels like sort of the meatiest of this work. So we'll sort of stay here on this culturally responsible point for a bit. So we'll start off with some questions to consider. So the first one is, who are the heroes? Who, if you're telling a story about a scientific discovery or something great that happened, really thinking about who are the heroes, whose voices, contributions, and stories are included. And then on the flip side, who's not represented in these stories? We have found, Aparna and I work mostly in the environmental and conservation sector and experiential education, and we have found so many stories about different issues that have not been told. Like for a long time, we often heard about Rachel Carson, who was just this fantastic person who was really important and instrumental in bringing the issue of pesticides to the forefront of the national conversation. And our partner, Jose Gonzalez, told us that it's actually the United Farm Workers that started that conversation. And it's really important to understand that the United Farm Workers were heroes in this sort of story about pesticides. It wasn't just Rachel Carson. So really thinking about who's not represented. It takes a really long time to unbury those stories, especially when talking about science. I think there's a lot of stories that are not told, but that's our work as educators, as librarians, as library staff. It's really important for us to continue to unbury those stories. And then similar to this is, what perspectives are missing or ways of knowing are missing? Am I only focused on Western science? So for example, if you're teaching about or creating programming about climate or weather, it's really important to include an Indigenous perspective, because it's well documented that certain tribes, particularly up in Alaska, have been noting climate change and changes in weather far before Western science even thought to start researching it. So that's just one example that always comes to mind of, what perspectives would we really benefit from that, and that's not part of our general sort of conversation when it comes to science. There are a lot of different ways in which communities engage in science, and it's really important to expose patrons to all the ways that knowledge gets produced.
There's another story I think about there that we'll share. NPR did a story, I believe, on an indigenous person who has a blow up planetarium that he goes around in to teach North American indigenous constellations and names. It's really interesting to think about the history of astronomy and where that came from. And so if you're thinking about astronomy and the constellations, why is it that we haven't been learning, or why is it that we're not exposed to North American native names for the stars that we see in the sky?
Great. So the fourth question that we're asking you all is, how are people with marginalized identities being represented? So we ask this because we often see these lists or sort of sidebars in magazines or blogs where it's like 10 great women scientists or 10 great scientists of color. And that's fantastic. That should be in there. But it's also really important to understand that there's more work to be done. These scientists should also be regularly featured in programming. It shouldn't just be this sort of one-time deal where they get mentioned, but we really should be thinking about these people being part of the everyday conversation of who is contributing to science, who is a hero, who is an important thinker, et cetera. So really thinking through, if you have those sort of lists of 10 particular marginalized identity greatest scientists, or whoever else, making sure that those folks are also regularly integrated into programming that you all are doing. The other piece that I wanted to ask here is, where are you getting your information and who are the authors? So if you're creating programming, especially about a specific community or a particular culture, like Aparna just said, a particular tribe's cosmology, where are you getting that information? You really want to be sure to responsibly source that information. So that means doing your research to understand who is providing this information and are they a reliable source? I know that you all as library staff are well versed in that, but we would be remiss if we didn't say this. Often, as Aparna was just talking about, often when talking about indigenous cosmology, non-native people will have written quite a bit, but it's not totally clear where they've gotten that information and what the protocols are, the indigenous protocols are to be able to write that book or that paper. So it's really important to understand, and often authors who are non-native, who have sourced that responsibly, will actually outline that for you of like, this is the protocol that I went through. So again, I know that you all as library staff are really great at finding and citing reputable sources, but we'd be remiss if we didn't mention that marginalized communities and individuals often have been misrepresented in texts, without really an avenue to set the record straight. And as library staff, you all have an opportunity and a responsibility to right that wrong. The next piece I want to talk about is to ask you all if there are any stereotypes being perpetuated. And to be able to answer that question, we wanted to just share a little bit of information on how we define stereotypes. The word that gets thrown about quite a bit, but we want to just give you all some information so you're on the same page. So we define stereotypes as a widely held but oversimplified idea about a person based on their identities. And those identities can be real or perceived, right? So you can perceive someone's identity in all different ways, and you might be right or wrong. Nevertheless, if you think you're right, you might still have these stereotypes about them. So I wanted to share this particular stereotype with you, or these two stereotypes with you all. One is boys will be boys and girls will be girls. And I would love to hear from you all, what's implied when we say boys will be boys or girls will be girls? So the question is, what's implied when we say boys will be boys or girls will be girls? Someone said what's implied is that gender identity is binary. Absolutely, right? So this gives no space for people to identify beyond the binary. Another person says it dismisses poor behavior, patriarchy. Boys don't need to learn or display self-control. It can excuse certain behaviors. Girls are sweet and kind and nice, and girls love flowers and pink and purple. Okay. Boys are consistently categorized as rowdy, girls as needing to be homelier. Okay. Thank you everyone for participating. The second question that I want to ask you all is what's the impact? And someone already named an impact, which is, it sort of shows you that there's only 2 genders, which is not true. There are millions of genders. But what's the impact if you just say, oh, those boys will be boys? And some of you all were saying it would excuse poor behavior. And someone says, if a boy or a girl does not act in a stereotypical way, then they're abnormal or weird. There's no room for growth. Doesn't allow people to reach their potential. Great. Not great in terms of the impacts, but great in terms of your participation. Thank you, everyone. So you're absolutely right. These stereotypes really limit people's ability to see themselves and to see other folks. It limits growth. It reinforces a gender binary in this particular stereotype. It really just doesn't allow people to be themselves and limits our ability to see them for who they really are. There's a second stereotype that, or an image that often comes up. We wanted to share this with you all. About STEM. So this first image here is, wow, you suck at math. And this is a person, I'm assuming this person is male, just given that, given the second frame. And, you know, this individual's behavior, inability to do a math problem is really just attributed to their individual capacity, versus this other photo over here, this other frame over here, of a girl trying to do a problem, gets it wrong. Then this person here categorizes all girls and all women as not being good at math. And so that's another way in which a stereotype gets expressed in the way that we talk with one another. So I wanted to share that one because I thought it might be relevant to the work that you all do, given that you're doing a lot of STEAM or STEM work. I wanted to share some more information about this sort of danger of a single story or a danger of a stereotype. So this quote comes from Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and she says that when a particular story about a group of people is told over and over again, it becomes our single story, becomes a stereotype that, although may be true for some, is incomplete because it is not true for all. Power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make that the definitive story of that other person. So we think that this quote is pretty powerful because it really sort of sheds light on the complexity of stereotypes. For some people, the stereotype, they may actually resonate with that, and that's fine. For other people, it doesn't work for them, and they may have a very different relationship to that stereotype. And it's really important for us to all as individuals to be able to tell our own story. And we can help others tell their own story by really paying close attention to who they are, what they need, and not making assumptions about them, not letting our unconscious bias, that confirmation come in and really predetermine who they are. Okay, so that's a little bit on stereotypes. And the last question to consider as it relates to culturally responsible programming is just thinking about the images that you all select. So is there any unconscious bias in the images that you all select? Wanted to do a really quick discussion with you all is to show you this picture and ask you, do you notice anything about this picture or how unconscious bias might be at play? If you've seen this before, and you know what the answer is or what we're getting at, maybe hold back so other folks can figure it out for themselves. So again, what do you notice about this picture? How might unconscious bias be at play? Someone says, OMG. So yeah, a person says, only non-white kids are causing trouble. And the girls are well behaved. So this is an image from the Red Cross, and it came under fire, I don't know how many years ago, but y'all are correct that all of the people who are engaging in quote unquote not cool behavior are young people of color. And all of the people who are engaging in quote unquote cool behavior are white folks. So this is just an example of image bias, and it's important for you all just to think about what's implied in all of your images, and maybe having a second set of eyes on them. And then also just when you get that feedback of like, hey, that image impacted me negatively in some way or another, making sure that you have the flexibility to change it, and the willingness to change it. So that's image bias. I'm going to go through tips on being culturally responsive, and then we'll like pause, take a breather, see if there's any questions before we go into the structure piece. So again, being culturally responsive really just means that you employ facilitation strategies that reach all patrons, or it's how you facilitate, or pedagogy. Hopefully one of those ways I've described it makes sense to you all. We just have a couple of different tips to think about. First is to understand patrons' various abilities, especially when you're working with people across generations, formal education levels, and varying familiarity with the English language. It's really just important to use language that is clear and be able to describe different concepts a couple of different ways. This is something that we have to do at the Avarna Group. Justice, equity, diversity, inclusion work can sometimes get really academic and theoretical, and it's really important for us to be able to describe these concepts in a couple of different ways, and hope that you all do the same. Then there's also thinking about the ways in which people like to learn. So endeavor to find or to include facilitation methods that include learning not just from you talking, but from reading, from experiencing or experimenting. So those hands-on activities can be really helpful. From visual media, so making sure that you have a couple of different ways to show what you're trying to do. Audio media, and anything else. So I often just think about like, if I'm delivering a program or a lesson plan, do I have a couple of times where students or participants or patrons are going to be able to get up and move? Are they going to be able to discuss with one another? How am I going to make this an experiential thing for them where they actually get to sort of walk through a process that helps their learning? So those are all things that I'm thinking about. You don't have to have like all of these different facilitation methods for everything that you're trying to get across, but really try and shake it up a little bit. So you're not just relying on 1 to 2 different facilitation methods. As I've been saying, have alternative ways of facilitating, or alternative ways for patrons to engage in programming. And I've been talking about this sort of just in the moment, but also making sure that if you do have some sort of kinesthetic or movement-based activity, that you're thinking through any sort of alternatives as it relates to movement if you're working with folks who use mobility aids, and then also just alternative methods of explaining a concept. And then finally, employ a patron-centered instructional approach. So this is really centering their experience. This can be project-based. So sort of setting up a problem for them to solve over X amount of time. It can be community learning, which we have been doing a bit of here, of just learning from one another. This is sort of just comes from the assumption that you all actually know quite a bit, and you as the facilitator are just pulling that out and organizing that information. And then also collaborative learning. So how are folks learning in a group together? Oops, sorry. Okay. That is the culturally responsive facilitation. There's a lot more that we could get into, but first I want to just take a breather and let you all, this is a lot of information to throw at you at once. And then second, I just want to see if there's any questions that you all have, anything that you want me to go back over as it relates to any of these 3 R's and program content. So any questions, anything I can clarify?
While people are thinking, I have a thought. I'm going to go off script because I was thinking about the fact that we're about to head into Black History Month. And so as you think about programming on content, one of the things that that we are really careful about is making sure that there isn't stereotyping, that information is coming from the source, and that One of the things we see, and maybe not necessarily with Black History Month, but with like days like Indigenous Peoples Day, is the distilling of cultures into the 4Fs: food, folklore, fables, and festivals, and thinking a little bit more critically when you feature books and writings and art, et cetera, voices of people from certain communities, to not represent a whole community based on those 4Fs, because that can be really reductive.
So someone was asking, could you say again what project-based means within patron-centered instructional approaches? So project-based really just means that you create some sort of, I mean, I'm trying to come up with another word for project, but something that like a group of patrons need to do together. So a like really simple example is, I don't know if you all have ever played this game of like, you need to create the tallest structure using dried spaghetti and marshmallows. And so you've given, like, that's their project, and they have to figure out together how to do that. And so that is what I mean by project-based, rather than like delivering a lecture, which is really just about delivering content. For the project-based is really about them problem solving and figuring out what types of information they need to solve the problem themselves. So I hope that answers it. And then,
and with the project-based learning in the, I forgot to say that I taught at the Department of Education at Montana State. And so the project-based learning in the traditional education world often comes up with students actually solving real world problems. So thinking about issues in the community that they can actually work together to solve with a particular project could be another way. So it's not an arbitrary, let's see who builds the structure the fastest, which is collaborative learning and it's exciting, but it's really focused on problem solving in a real world sense.
okay. And then someone had just mentioned thinking about folks' heights as it relates to how you all set up your libraries or any sort of display. We'll actually get around to built environment in just a minute. And so I want to hold off on that. And Aparna, if you don't remember, I will cue you to, we'll talk about that a little bit more. And so it'll make a little bit more sense in the context of the built environment.
Great.
Okay, with that said, I am going to now hand it off to Aparna, who's going to talk a little bit more about program structure. We just talked about program content, now program structure.
Yeah, and I want to just like a disclaimer here is that we have really focused this entire webinar on programming. So if you're not necessarily in programming, if you're working in circulation, or like book or like requisition, think about how some of these tips apply to you. Because I think, for example, in the structure tips, and I should say, yeah, is that spelled right? Yes, structure. Some of these can also apply to, again, like spacing between racks of books. So program structure is really about not the delivery of the programming itself, but really about the little logistical pieces. And some folks have already started talking about this in the chat box. How do you get people to your libraries? How do you sign people up? Do you even sign people up? So the first thing we want to talk about is the sign up process and making sure that it's clear and can happen a few different ways. I'm going to actually pause because I'll mention these tips, but there was somebody in the chat box way long ago who mentioned that they don't even require signups, and I want to hear more about that. But if you do have a sign up process, make sure that it happens online, over the phone, and in person. We know that this can vary across libraries and geographies. It may take some experimenting to figure out how to best get folks to actually register or sign up for your programming. The second thing is it should be really clear about any costs, any fees, anything associated with that program. Make sure to mention it up front. If it's free, make sure to mention that. And then finally, when possible, again, think about languages that are spoken in the community and provide signups in multiple relevant languages. Though be sure to mention that if the program is only in English, that it'll be only in English. Often caregivers and parents will sign children up for programming that they will not necessarily participate in, but if they don't understand the program, they may be less likely to sign up. So that is just some information about the sign up process. There's one person who says we do not require signups at all, either and expected in very specific cases. trying to be barrier free. That's great. Another library says we gave up on signups because the ones who did sign up didn't show up, and then folks who didn't sign up did. On the subject of signups, there's data showing that Latinx patrons and other immigrants from non-Western countries tend not to do signups because they don't want to take spots from others, meaning they don't get to participate in programming. So, I think that, again, these tips, take this with a grain of salt and think really clearly about whether you want to do a sign up in the first place. And then if you do, these are some things to consider. The next thing I wanted to talk about was logistics. Again, you've all been talking about this. Information that you provide should be clear about the logistics, the date, time, location should all be there. Simple, but sometimes forgotten in the materials. When you're thinking actually about times, well, I'll talk about this in a second, provide information about transportation options. So what's the best public transportation option to get to the library, which bus, which train number, even potentially the schedule. If possible, based on when the programming is occurring, and I know this is a cost issue, but provide meals if programming is happening during meal times, and if you do provide meals, endeavor to make sure that they're culturally relevant and healthy meals, which can often be found in restaurants that are run by local community members, a really great way to support local businesses in and around your library. A real quick thing about timing before this next one is just really think intentionally about timing, because sometimes timing is exactly at dinner time, or sometimes timing is happening when a lot of parents, working parents, are not able to get their young people to the library. The next tip is consider delivering programming outside of the library. I don't know how many of you do mobile programming, but we have a partner, the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy, that in the San Francisco Bay Area has a mobile library set up, and they travel to different communities. Likewise, the Lafayette Public Library in the San Francisco Bay Area also goes to a nearby trailer park to deliver content. And I'm not sure if it's Lafayette in the Bay Area or another Lafayette. I think, Brooks, that was one of your contributions. The final piece about programming, and I was talking about timing, is make sure to just ask folks about timing in the community. Do they want programming on weekends? Do they want after school programming or evening programming? If you're not sure, it's often helpful to provide programming at several different times and just see which one is used the most. And many families have those varying schedules, so it's just important to make sure that you're timing it right. The next thing I want to talk about is programs with program structure is your built environment. And, this is going to be a pretty light touch because we didn't know how many of you all would be actually responsible for the physical work structure or the physical structures within your library. So a few tips here: provide patrons with gender neutral bathrooms if they're available. Ensure that folks who use mobility aids, and this is something someone mentioned in the chat box, whether you're chairbound, whether you have crutches, you're able to move freely within the library. Often libraries do have to adhere to those ADA standards, but we just would urge you all to think about going even beyond that, especially if your programming involves moving around. The third piece is ensuring that your decor is welcoming and reflects your values of being inclusive. So this could be having posters with visible diversity, representations of people in the community, having signs in multiple languages. Someone mentioned about displays, making sure that displays have multiple identities represented in it. And then finally, if outside the library, make sure that you have adequate lighting for people to feel safe walking to and from the library. And this is something that gets often overlooked, but for a lot of communities, safety is a real primary consideration. And so is there adequate lighting? So we know that, community dialogues is a great way for you all to gather feedback about a community's needs. And we mentioned it earlier, and it's, I think, somewhere in the chat box, a free resource from the Space Science Institute website.
And then I just wanted to also mention that this is where any sort, if you're creating any sort of display or shelving, if you have important stuff on a shelf, make sure that everyone can use it. Not only for folks who are shorter, for young people, but also, again, those folks who are maybe using wheelchairs or using mobility aids and they can't quite reach up. So just wanted to add that piece back in and contextualize it per that previous comment.
Great. And one other thing I did think about was interpretive programming. And I don't know how many of you all are interpretive like exhibits, how many of you venture into that space, but we have an article we'll share with you about, especially if you're in an older building that has some historic items on display or like renditions of history, thinking about what's implied in those images. And we have an article that was looked at in the context of one museum, and they were able to really scrutinize the exhibit and think about who's represented, who's not represented, who are the heroes, who's being stereotyped, et cetera. So we'll share that with you. Someone else also mentioned in the chat box that it's a safety concern with tall bookshelves removing lines of sight, especially with children. So that's everything we can share right now. And I'm sure there's a ton more about the built environment. The last piece I want to talk about with structure is just a productive learning environment. So beyond the tips that Ava talked about with culturally responsive facilitation, this is really about the care that you all put into setting your patron up for success in the program. What's the framing for your program? What are the introductions? So providing people with name tags and welcoming them to share their pronouns voluntarily is one way to do it. And that's happening more and more. During introductions, inviting patrons to share anything they want you to know about themselves. So we often in our workshops say, is there anything that you want us to know that we wouldn't know, that you want us to know about you today? Another thing is the icebreakers. And I think it could, especially with young people, is really tempting to do icebreakers, and they're great, but think about if the icebreaker is relevant to everyone. So staying away from questions like, what's your favorite vacation? Or pop culture references like Harry Potter, knowing that all patrons don't have that opportunity to go on vacation, or they may not all know about or watch Harry Potter or read Harry Potter books. The last thing is something we do as well, is providing them with group agreements. And I know this for a tiny, like 1-2 hour program may seem silly, but I think it's really important to make sure everyone understands that, like, hey, we're here for 2 hours together. And here's how you all can contribute to an inclusive learning space. Here's how we should all show up. And it could be anything like being kind to each other, being compassionate, thinking about the impact of your words. There's so many things that can go in that productive learning environment group agreement. Okay, I have one last thing to cover, and then I'm just loving all of your interactions on the chat box. So we'll get back to the chat box in a second. I want to talk about your interactions with patrons. And somebody mentioned early on that they don't assume any patron's gender, identity, and they use gender neutral pronouns. And then they also mentioned earlier that they wear a rainbow tag so that folks would know that they're like a safe person to go to if they identify as LGBTQ. So that's something I'll just put out there that was shared by one of you. And then we have a lot more. We do a whole workshop on individual interactions, how to mitigate your bias, how to take feedback, how to receive feedback. So we've distilled it down to a few tips for you all here today. So we have pre-work. So what do you do to mitigate your bias? When I say mitigate bias, it means like creating those new neural pathways so that you don't always assume that a doctor and unconsciously think a doctor is a male or is a man. So consume information by people different from you. So stay out of those echo chambers that we tend to create for ourselves. This is one way to do it. Understand your own identities and their relationship to power and privilege. We all hold identities based on which we may have advantages and systemic advantages, and identities based on which we may experience systemic disadvantages or barriers. So understanding all of that is really important, and just carving out time for your own learning. Hopefully you are actually given that time by your supervisors to be able to do that learning. And then there's this, and then take care of yourself. And especially, this can mean a lot of different things, but it can be really uncomfortable to do some of this individual work, confronting your biases, confronting your privilege, learning about how we are complicit in systems of oppression. I know for me, a lot of times I have to take space and process through all the feelings that come up, whether it's grief, whether it's guilt, whether it's shame, whether, going through those feelings and taking care of myself is one of the most important ways to be able to continue to learn and make space for that learning. The next set of tips under interactions is about the in the moment pieces. So mitigating bias in the moment when you're interacting with patrons or program participants. So the first tip we have there is just remain curious. Ask questions to understand where they're coming from. I'll add a disclaimer here that sometimes, just thinking about what questions you're asking, oftentimes when Ava and I go on the road and are in a pretty rural or white area, I'm a person of color and I often get asked like, where are you from? No, where are you from? And so thinking about the where are you from question is important because sometimes it can indicate to a person, especially if they're a person of color, that they're a foreigner or they don't belong. But you can ask more meaningful questions about like, hey, what brings you here today? Curiosity, inquiry, etc. The second piece is asking yourself what you're not seeing in the moment and how that may reshape your thoughts. And this is really in those moments where you feel like something is not going right. Something may be happening on your programs between patrons, and maybe you're making some assumptions. And so slowing down in those moments is really important because as I mentioned earlier with the Delta Airlines example, it's when you react very quickly that your unconscious biases tend to take control. And then on the flip side, I think if someone in your library is making exclusive, exclusionary, or harmful comments, it's going to be really important, as someone said, to be an ally, it's really important for you all to have those difficult conversations and to be able to call those patrons in, to state your inclusion values at the library clearly, to demonstrate to other patrons that their behavior is not welcome. And this starts with even signage that you may have in your library about everyone being welcome, but I think it also then manifests in your behaviors and role modeling that certain behaviors are not okay in your libraries. So that was a very fast rendition of what we usually cover in a day-long workshop. We covered a lot of material and, there's so much more to cover, but we wanted to dedicate some serious time to Q&A and peer learning. If we don't get to your questions in the 10 minutes we have left, you're welcome to email us. And this is our email address and information. But before we start the Q&A, we just wanted to remind you all again that this is a lifelong practice. We're on this journey with you, mitigating bias in ourselves, in our libraries, in the library sector is a lifelong journey. So we hope that today you have some ideas, at least one idea that you can take away with you to move forward. But we assume that the work does not stop at the end of this webinar. So thank you all for your engagement. And I'm going to now turn it over to the chat box to see if there's anything interesting that we wanted to have conversation about.
So there was one person that was talking about library rules and policies are exclusionary. And I think that what Aparna, I'm wondering if that was in reaction to what Aparna was saying around making sure that you state your inclusion values so you can really tell a particular patron, hey, that behavior is not welcome here. I think what I want to make sure we say is it can be very powerful for you all as an institution, as a group of people to come up with your equity and inclusion values. That's other work that we do. Have all of the library staff buy into that. And then you sort of use that to hold each other accountable and also hold patrons accountable. So it can be beyond existing policies, and it may actually force you all to go look at some of those existing policies that are exclusionary. So just wanted to put that out there.
There's some folks who shared just in terms of exposing yourself to different perspectives. The Pop Sugar Reading Challenge or a book club is a great way to force yourself to go outside your comfort zone in terms of reading. There's a really good question here. So this comes from a person who says that she's a white queer woman, and when doing collections, and I'll say we probably have so many thoughts on collections that we didn't talk about today, but you find it easier to prioritize buying materials that focus on people of color, but you're a little bit more hesitant to focus on buying too many, in quotes, materials about queer folks because you don't want to get pigeonholed as the queer librarian. So any recommendations on how to resist that anxiety? I hear you. And I think that, finding, a couple of things I can think of is, leaning on research instead of your own personal preference can really help people realize that this is not based on your own identities or experiences necessarily, but based on the fact that having queer authors, books with queer heroes is really important for every young person's development and exposure to different perspectives. And so I think to the extent you can find those articles, that research that talks about that, then it becomes less about you. But I think the second piece is also finding allies who maybe don't identify as queer, who are sometimes I, as a person of color, have to lean on white folks in my life to push certain messages for me. A, because sometimes I'm just tired of being the person who's a squeaky wheel. And B, because I know that if sometimes those white folks can actually influence leadership in more effectively. And so those are a couple ways in which I deal with that sort of fear and hesitation. And I'm curious, Ava, if you have other thoughts.
I can sort of identify with this as someone who sort of tends to be in really male dominated spaces and wanting to make sure that like women's voices are elevated while also knowing that white women have this very problematic history and need to make it intersectional. So wanted to say, A, I hear you. B, I think that this isn't necessarily a strategy, but like I would just keep suggesting queer authors. Queer authors have been so pushed to the margins, just like people of color in libraries. And so just keep going. Like there are young people that are most likely so excited to read from some of these folks, and just know that like you're reaching folks, even if sometimes they don't always tell you that. And then if there's anyone that you sort of trust within your library staff to be able to say like, hey, I would love it if you would just sort of like be in this with me. And like Aparna said, finding those allies. But I think that I would just encourage you to keep finding queer authors, just like you've committed to finding authors of color, because your patrons really probably are appreciating it.
There's a big conversation happening on the chat box that I wanted to weigh in on as well, on people who experience homelessness. And I live in Eugene, which I think news came out that has the highest per capita houseless or homeless population. And that libraries often are very exclusionary in terms of allowing folks to who are homeless to even enter. And so there were some suggestions on there, and I think thinking about, one person mentioned developing programming specifically for folks who are experiencing homelessness can really help shift away from that public perception and the rules. I think that sometimes the city or the county may have some rules that you all feel like you can't change regarding that. And so to what extent can you influence that is another thing to think about.
One other thing that I'll say about transient, homeless, unhoused communities is, and I don't know if this is something that you all are already doing, but worth reaching out to other social service organizations and see how you all can coordinate how to connect and care with those communities. And that's not necessarily changing like a library policy, but creating a more robust social net, knowing that public spaces like libraries have been really instrumental in folks just being able to stay warm and have sort of a community space, knowing that you all provide that service, making sure that you can also bolster those services that you're already providing by connecting with other organizations. So like in Missoula, Montana, here we have quite a few organizations that are working with transient populations to make sure that they're warm, housed, fed, especially in the winter months. Any other questions for us? And it sounds like the community, I just want to sort of, this thing is the third time we've mentioned the community dialogues, but it seems like that's been an incredibly helpful resource for folks on various different topics. So would encourage you all to go take a look at that. And it looks like Claire just linked out to the community dialogues. Thank you, Claire.
Yeah, and so this is Brooks. I just want to jump on real quick. I just linked to another webinar that we've done about those community dialogues. I know we keep on bringing it up because that is our one area of really being able to do good community engagement that we feel like we have a good resource for you all. But yeah, so I hope you can check that out, or you could always email Claire or I, and we could provide more information on that as well.
And I just plopped in 2 articles I mentioned in the webinar about the astronomy, Indigenous peoples astronomy, and then the Natural History Museum diorama analysis.
And then the other thing that I'm not sure if this was mentioned, but there's a URL for our website and our resources page in particular. And that is a space where you can actually do particular searches for different types of content. So like audio, video, articles, books. And then you also can search by topic. A lot of our resources tend to be, again, focused on environmentalism, conservation, outdoor and experiential education, though I think a lot of it translates to the work that you all do as well. So feel free to take a look at that, as if you all didn't have enough resources flying at you in this Zoom chat, but that is there for you all.
I think with that, we can wrap up. I'll just pop back on to thank whomever's left for hanging out with us for an hour and a half. And thank you, Brooks and Claire, for hosting this.
Yeah, thank you all so much. And, I think we have 80 folks still on, so I think pretty engaging stuff. So we'll reach out to all of you that attended the webinar and provide some links for you all. And you can find the recording on our website within the next 24 hours, but I'll make sure that gets out to all of you. So when you leave here, you'll be redirected to a survey. We really ask that you take that survey and provide some feedback for us. Really, thank you all so much. You are bringing out a lot of information in the chat box and, drawing on your own expertise. So
Yeah.
We just really appreciate it. And thanks so much to Aparna and Ava for kind of kicking off our yearly webinar series with a good one.
Yeah, this is great. And just a reminder to everybody, the recording of this will be available on YouTube. And in 24 hours, there will be closed captioning available for that. So if you wanted to share that with your coworkers or anybody else. And I just dropped the link one more time for the certificate of attendance. If that is something you need for professional development, you have that in the chat box as well.
All right. Well, happy 2020, everybody. We'll see you all soon.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.